Now I'll turn to introducing our speaker for the day, Richard Hollinger, who is an old friend of mine. I think I've known you, Richard, for 30 some odd years.
Let's not say.
Let's not say. Too much white hair on the heads of both of us. Richard is originally from California, became a Baha'i in the 1970s, holds a master's degree in Middle Eastern history from UCLA, also a degree in public history and historic preservation from California State College of Dominguez Hills. And with that, he was an archivist at the University of Maine, a job he recently retired from. He's conducted research and published on American and Middle Eastern Baha'i history, and wrote a chapter on Shoghi Effendi for the recently published book, The World of the Bahá'í Faith. And his chapter, to some extent, is part of the subject that we will hear from him about today. So I will now turn the floor over to Richard. Thank you so much for joining us, Richard. We're looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Okay, well, I'd like to start by explaining why I even think there should be a period of the early guardianship or early years of the guardianship. And I think it will be more clear if we just consider what the Baha'i world was when he became guardian in 1922. Well, maybe 21 technically. There were Baha'i communities in the Middle East and India, Russia, a few countries in Europe and North America. Baha'i administration was very undeveloped. There were some local assemblies and some ad hoc national and regional institutions, but nothing that really conformed to the instructions about the Baha, at least at the national level. In terms of Baha'i identity, a lot of the Western Baha'is and maybe elsewhere had dual identities or were just really devoted to Abdu'l-Bahá, but didn't necessarily embrace the Baha'i faith in its totality, or they were attracted to certain teachings like the equality of men and women, or racial unity and so forth. So there were a lot of different levels of commitment and familiarity with the teachings. And the community had rather loose boundaries because there were no membership requirements at that time. In Palestine itself, there were Baha'is scattered around in various places. There were 3 Baha'i villages. There was a community in Haifa. And there were Baha'is who were secretaries to high-level British mandate officials, including the governor for northern Palestine, who could act as liaisons between Baha'is and the government. Well, all of those things would change in the next 15 years, everything. So Abdu'l-Bahá had been ill for several weeks prior to his death, and he had directed that Shoghi Effendi be summoned to Haifa to be with him, but his parents delayed in contacting him because they didn't want to interrupt his academic term. Consequently, he wasn't there when Abdu'l-Bahá died. He was further delayed by travel documents, so he didn't arrive until to December 29th. He learned of his appointment as guardian shortly thereafter. This had been kept largely a secret, including from him. There were a few people who did know about his appointment as guardian, but most people were in fact expecting the election of the Universal House of Justice, not the least of whom was Shoghi Effendi himself. He anticipated that he might be called upon to convene an election. He didn't anticipate being being appointed as guardian. Since people were expecting the election of the Universal House of Justice, there was an attempt, I think, to just gradually release the information about the guardianship. So first, Shoghi Effendi learned of it, then 9 members of the family were read the will, and there was a public reading. And in mid-January, the Greatest Holy Leaf cabled to the major Baha'i communities that Shoghi Effendi had been appointed guardian of the cause and president of the House of Justice. Shoghi Effendi gave a few Baha'is copies of the will in its entirety, but he asked them to keep it private, and he circulated only excerpts, and those were not the excerpts that gave him the most authority. So he was trying to, I guess, lessen the blow. In January, towards the end of January, he began summoning some prominent Baha'is from around the world to come to Haifa to consult about the future of the cause, including the election of the House of Justice. I would say unclear what Shoghi Effendi thought at that time about electing the House of Justice, but by the time they got there a few weeks later, he had made up his mind clearly that it was not possible to do so. This he did through a study of writings, and he found a tablet in which Abdu'l-Bahá explained how the House of Justice was to be elected, and that it had to be elected by national assemblies, which were in turn elected by delegates who were elected by Baha'is at the local level directly. And he also felt there had to be proportional representation. So none of the existing institutions really met those qualifications. However, I would say that the consultation still proved to be really useful, because it, although most of the Baha'is who came there thought the House of Justice might well be elected, it gave them a chance to be educated by Shoghi Effendi about what those what next steps would be towards electing a house, that they had to start electing local assemblies and national assemblies and spreading the faith and so forth, and to get some buy-in from them. They also consulted about other, issues that came up. One major one was the seizure of Baha'u'llah's house in Baghdad, which this had been done by some Shi'i authorities, who, I guess it was in a Shi'i neighborhood, if I recall, and they turned it into some kind of Shi'i center. I've forgotten the details. Mountford Mills and Roy Wilhelm were tasked with trying to get diplomatic support to get the house back, and telegrams were sent to King Faisal directly requesting justice in the matter. Another issue was the forcible seizure of keys to Baji by the partisans of Muhammad Ali in Akka. The government authorities had taken charge of the keys and placed guards outside Baji until the matter was resolved. However, Colonel Sims, who was the governor of northern Palestine, was strongly encouraging Shoghi Effendi to elect the House of Justice, because he felt that having an elected institution would demonstrate more widespread support among Baha'is than an appointed leader. Shoghi Effendi did establish a local spiritual assembly of Haifa that was appointed the first year but elected thereafter. And so that may have been partly a response to that. There was also a good deal of discussion about the development of properties at the World Centre. The property on Mount Carmel, as these photos show, had just begun to be developed. And in the coming years, would be done under Shoghi Effendi's immediate supervision. According to Mason Ramey's notes, and Mason Ramey was really brought there to consult about Baha'i properties and architecture. The Rizwan Garden was in a state of disrepair with fences fallen down, broken seats, and so forth. Shoghi Effendi consulted with him about the pilgrim's house he had designed, which had just started being built, actually, and also about the Mashraq al-Azkar on Mount Carmel, which still hasn't been built, but is his design. And he consulted with him about enhancing the Shrine of the Bab. And from what I gather, Roy Wilhelm and Mountford Mills also took part in these discussions, as did some members of the Iranian and German crews that were building the Pilgrim House. The initial instructions that Shoghi Effendi gave to the Baha'i community were first to, in March, he directed all communities with 9 or more Baha'is to establish LSAs. And we still have that directive today. He requested a census from the Baha'i community of Iran, and I think he did that for the Baha'is of North America as well, because there is a listing of all the believers in North America in 1922, but I haven't found a letter from him requesting it. And he asked some of the people who were he brought there to consult with him to get various counts of communities and believers, and sometimes what he, I think, referred to as true believers, and some diary accounts. And he directed some specific national assemblies, national communities, such as Germany, the UK, and the US, to form NSAs. And at this point, I want to sort of diverge for a minute and talk about Shoghi Effendi's work style, because his ministry can't really be very well understood without making some reference to this. Pilgrim's notes from throughout his ministry record Shoghi Effendi's long hours, his intense work, his lack of sleep, his light eating habits, skipping meals. For example, Mountford Mills noted this, quote, Shoghi Effendi works mercilessly, regardless of sleep, meals, etc. And it is the constant wish of the family to get him to take reasonable exercise in the open air. He sometimes takes walks, which were devoted to serious talks, and just as in his study, all waking hours are given to severe mental labor. Again and again, he broke down under it. And Ali Akbar Furatan recorded that Shoghi Effendi slept only 4 hours a day and worked for 20 hours. And this is, I could cite a lot of different pilgrim's notes that record this 4 hours and the long work hours. So I don't think this is an anomaly. These habits seem to have developed when he was working as Abdu'l-Bahá secretary, when he often was up past midnight taking dictation or translating correspondence, and then again up at dawn. At that time, he worked so hard that he became sick, and Abdu'l-Bahá sent him to a sanatorium in France to recover. The doctor there said that he had a nervous illness and prescribed a daily routine of rest for half the day, walking for half the day, and he also instructed him to limit his contact with the Baha'i community. During most of his ministry, Shoghi Effendi worked with this level of intensity, and then he took extended vacations away from Haifa. These were typically in the summer months, as he seems to have had some susceptibility to repeated bouts of malaria. And that was prevalent in the Haifa area during the summer in those days anyway. During his early ministry, he mostly went to Switzerland and spent his time in vigorous hikes during this time. But he went to other places. He went to France, he went to South Africa. And after his marriage, I think they went to different places. So in April of 1922, Shoghi Effendi left Haifa, and he left the affairs of the cause in the hands of the Greatest Holy Leaf and the LSA of Haifa, which at that time was appointed, but was subsequently elected. However, the trip was different from his subsequent vacations that I've kind of described. Shoghi Effendi was coming to terms with the weight of his responsibilities, not just recovering from intense work. Leroy Iowis reported that Shoghi Effendi recalled this period as follows. And of course, this isn't necessarily Shoghi Effendi's exact words, but quote, "I found that I was appointed guardian of the cause, and I didn't want to be guardian of the cause. I knew what it meant. I knew my life as a human being was over. I left the Holy Land and went up to the mountains of Switzerland, and I fought with myself until I conquered myself. Then I came back and I turned myself over to God, and I was guardian." So in December of 1922, he returned to Haifa and began organizing to do the work of the guardian. One of the most daunting aspects of leading the community, both for Abdu'l-Bahá and for Shoghi Effendi, was carrying on correspondence, because there were so many individuals as well as institutions who wrote for guidance. And so a very ongoing theme in Shoghi Effendi's ministry was the need for secretarial support. During the early years, the 1920s, let's say, he used the Persian secretaries of Abdu'l-Bahá, and his father also did some secretarial work. English language secretaries were harder to come by, it seems. He struggled to find competent English language secretaries. He brought John Esselmont to Haifa in 1924, but he died the following year. And Ethel Rosenberg served as secretary for 1926 and 27. But other than that, he relied on members of his extended family, such as Ruhi Afnan and Sohail Afnan. And so he took he had envisioned and hoped to have a secretariat with a lead secretary and a staff who could assist him with this correspondence, but that didn't happen until maybe the very end of his ministry, when the International Teaching Center or International Baha'i Council was formed, functioned in that capacity to some extent. So he took some other measures to reduce correspondence. First, the appointment of the LSA of Haifa took away some of the need to engage with government officials and local organizations. he also instructed Baha'i communities to issue newsletters and to send those newsletters to other Baha'i communities, so they were sharing their stories. And then the LSA of Haifa published what was it for a long time, a very important newsletter, the Haifa newsletter, I think it was called, in which they curated stories from all of these different newsletters around the world. And now, that was really sort of the first international Baha'i news source. Shoghi Effendi also established the Baha'i Bureau in Geneva as a technically subordinate unit of the World Centre, and it provided support by engaging with international organizations and representing Baha'is in forums. But it also issued a trilingual newsletter that was circulated in Europe, carrying regional news of regional Baha'i activities. And since so much correspondence was really just about asking questions that might be answered with just more information about what was going on, these kind of things presumably did help. But let's not forget that secretarial and administrative support were not ends in themselves, but they were tools to work with the priorities that Shoghi Effendi had set. And his priorities were pretty clear. They were the development of the Baha'i properties at the World Centre. They were teaching, spreading the faith, and they were the development of Baha'i administration. And each of these rests on a mandate he found in the Baha'i writings. For Baha'i administration, it was the Will and Testament of Abdu'l-Bahá. For the development of Baha'i properties at the World Centre, it's the Tablet of Carmel. And for teaching, of course, it was the Tablets of the Divine Plan. At any rate, I would say these are the foundational documents for most of the Guardian's activities throughout his ministry. With regard to Baha'i administration, Shoghi Effendi moved very quickly to develop Baha'i administration wherever possible. He not only directed that these be elected, but on an ongoing basis, guided their functioning and developed the protocols that continue to be used today. Like Abdu'l-Bahá, he allowed some deviation from protocols when operating with these wasn't realistic, but these were temporary adaptations. For example, there were central assemblies for the Caucasus, Turkestan, Iraq, and Iran when electing NSAs could not be easily done. Another aspect of Baha'i administration, in my view, was his setting up membership requirements, which had not existed for a long time. And in 1925, he wrote to I think it was the NSA of the U.S., that all Baha'is must recognize the stations of the Bab, Baha'u'llah, and Abdu'l-Bahá, and they must practice, quote, unreserved acceptance of and submission to whatsoever has been revealed by their pen. That may be a typo, it may be pens, but anyway, Shoghi Effendi knew that many of those considered Baha'is did not necessarily meet these criteria. This also served to begin creating community boundaries that were enhanced by the enforcement of Baha'i laws and further restrictions on individual Baha'i activities such as church membership. As for the World Centre properties, which were under his direct supervision, he also moved very quickly. The the Shrine of the Bab was first lit up in 1922. Of course, that was begun under Abdu'l-Bahá. In 1924, Shoghi Effendi installed a water pump for gardens around the shrine, which became very important because he was constantly laying out gardens thereafter, and redesigning them. The construction of the Pilgrim House was completed in 1926, and in 1929 there were rooms added to the base of the Shrine of the Bab, and the renovation of Baji was initiated. In terms of teaching, it's my view that Shoghi Effendi did not intervene so directly in teaching in the 1920s and to some extent in the 1930s as in the ways he did later. Since the Tablet of Divine Plan was of recent vintage and outlined priorities for teaching, it does not appear that he felt the need to specify goals or activities relating to teaching. Rather, in the 1920s, he tended to offer general encouragement to teach or simply to stimulate teaching. With this in mind, he sent Persian teachers to Europe and America in 1923 and to Europe again in 1929. He approved the North American plans for unified action in 1926 and 1931, but he offered no recommendations for changes. However, beginning in 1930, he actively encouraged the translation of Baha'u'llah in the New Era as part of teaching activities, and he funded their publication himself. And by 1936, it had been published in the 30 languages. He also began directing individual travel teachers to destinations where he thought they could be most useful and began encouraging pioneering over travel teaching. In 1937, he, for the first time, offered his own plan with goals he had selected. This was the first 7-year plan for North America. He also, he did a lot of other things. I can't mention them all. He also contributed greatly to Baha'i literature, both in terms of his writing, but especially in terms of his translations of the writings. In the 1920s, he tended to translate rather small works like the Hidden Words, which is in fact translated by him before he was Guardian, but edited later. And I think he revised it again after the first publication, as I recall. He translated the tablet to Dr. Farrell and some other works. At this point, I'd like to discuss some of the changes that began to take place in the 1930s. The first thing, maybe the most important, was the death of the Greatest Holy Leaf in 1932. The fact is, there had long been some tension in Shoghi Effendi's family. It's not especially surprising that since the leadership of the faith skipped a generation, that there might be older members who've found it difficult to accept orders from a younger member of the family. However, the Greatest Holy Leaf still commanded pretty much universal respect, and she was able to keep the family together. In the same year that she died, 1932, there was a final plea to the League of Nations for Baha'u'llah's house to be returned to Baha'is. And one of the representatives from Iraq at the League of Nations that day was Shoghi Effendi's cousin, Hussein Afnan. And that delegation refused to turn the house over. And after that, that's the point at which Iraq became a sovereign country and was no longer part of the British mandate. There was no hope of adjudicating it any further through the League of Nations at that point. So Shoghi Effendi wrote to Hussein Afnan and told him to resign from his position so that people would not think he supported the seizure of the house, but he refused to do so. The following year, I don't know what else may have happened, but the following year, Shoghi Effendi declared him a covenant breaker. Shortly thereafter, his father was declared a covenant breaker because he wouldn't stop associating with his son. And gradually, throughout the 30s and 40s, one by one, members of Shoghi Effendi's extended family were expelled from the community until by 1952, I don't think there was anyone left from his birth family who was in the faith. Another thing that occurred during this period was the Arab Revolt, 1936 to 1939, roughly. I think Shoghi Effendi spent much of 1938 outside of Palestine because of it. But as a result, actually right at the beginning of the revolt, as I recall, he started asking Baha'is in Palestine to move, to disperse. He disbanded the Haifa LSA. And I think the Baha'i villages the Baha'is in Baha'i villages started to leave and sell their property. And those who were in positions like Badi Bushari who was the secretary to the governor, they were all expected to leave leave Palestine. And then the final thing was that Shoghi Effendi got married. He married Ruqayya Khanum. This may have even added to the tensions with his family, but it's hard to say exactly why, except that she's a Westerner and in-law, and there were always these rumors about Shoghi Effendi supposedly was supposed to marry a cousin or something, but I don't know if any of those stories are actually true. Nevertheless, there's always some tension with in-laws, and so it's, again, not surprising. On the other hand, she was his best source of support for the rest of his ministry. And she and her father, over the next few years, and particularly over the war years, were almost his only assistants in his work in Haifa. By 1937, let's say, 38, he was in a very different situation than he was in 1922. He had less local support, but much more global support within the Baha'i community, who had pretty universally accepted his authority and wisdom. So having won that, he was able to direct the Baha'i community to achieve those priorities that he had set out, electing the House of Justice, spreading the faith around the world, and developing the Baha'i properties. I think I shall end it there and take questions if anyone has them. Okay.
Thank you very much, Richard, for the fascinating coverage of somewhere between 10 and 15 years of the guardianship. And would you say then that there's sort of 10 years of one particular way of operating, then a 5-year transition kind of up to 37, something like that?
Something like that. I think about 1930 that things started to shift a little bit. But I think the death, 10 years would be right. Yeah, because the Greatest Holy Leaf died in 1932, and she was pretty critical to hold things together. So yeah, probably a 5-year transition, and maybe it's not an accident that he decided to get married in those years, because it was a good time.
Yeah. Well, it's also getting late for him.
It was
97.
Right.
So he's in 1932. He's already 35 years old.
Right.
And so
right.
The clock was ticking to some extent.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, it's just a fascinating set of questions that you've raised, and analysis that I think most people have not ever seen, or interpretation people have never seen. So I'm quite grateful for your exploration of this topic. Sandra says, it seems that the guardianship was a position that Shoghi Effendi actually imagined and shaped himself. Would you agree?
There's a number of accounts, pilgrim accounts, where people have, asked him about that. And he said, he's quoted as saying, I had to figure it out for myself. But I would say that he figured it out by himself by going to the writings. Yeah. and finding the mandates that were there. And I think he did that really early on. I think he did that in January and February of 1922, actually, which would be a natural reaction, to figure out what the job was. It's perhaps unfortunate he didn't get back earlier, because he might have had conversations with Abdu'l-Bahá about it, but that's not how it worked.
Yeah, that's right. Because the family was trying to. What was the date when Abdu'l-Bahá encouraged his parents to call him back? Was it October or was it early November?
It would have had to be. I'm not sure. I haven't been able to get a date for that. But they said several weeks earlier. Yeah. It would have been time for him to get there.
Yeah, exactly. Saeed asks, do you have a written version of your presentation?
Not exactly, but there is the article in the book that I think it's mostly drawn from.
Yeah, that's true. The book is The World of the Bahá'í Faith, published by Routledge, and Richard produced a chapter on Shoghi Effendi and the guardianship in that particular book. It's somewhere around chapter 5 or 6 or 7.
Yeah. It's massively overpriced, though, I'm sure.
Yeah, but you can buy the electronic version of the thing for $30 or $35. They say the paperback's supposed to come out in another year, a year after the publication date, which was December 31st of last year. So perhaps the paperback will come out soon. We'll see. Camilla asks, what was the Arab Revolt? So you may want to explain that.
Okay, so there were tensions between Jews and Arabs as the Jews started immigrating and buying up property, and also some tensions between the Arabs and the British at that particular time, although the British took their side later on. So there was it was basically a civil war that took place in Palestine between 1936 and 1939, and that's what they call it. The Arabs got put down, and the British ended up supporting some of the Jewish militias that I think they regret they did that subsequently because they turned on them.
That's true. Paul asks, when did Shoghi Effendi start designating believers posthumously as hands of the cause?
I don't know.
Yeah, the earliest one I can think of is, well, I don't know, actually. 40s? I don't know. It's an interesting question.
I think it would be easily found in Bahá'í World, but I don't know off the top of my head. I've forgotten. Yeah, there was some question about whether Fazl Mazindarani had ever been appointed a hand, and that might have been one. That might have been the first one, but I don't think he's on any of the official lists.
Yeah.
But
yeah, apparently there's quite a few people that there's communications of some sort, and the World Center has to sort through it and decide what to make of these communications too.
yeah,
Though some of them were living people, like Millie Collins, who was appointed by the Guardian as a hand, but in the 40s, but it wasn't publicized until 52, as I understand it. So she knew she was a hand when no one else knew she was a hand, apparently, for 5 years or so. Then there's Farzad asks this question. Thank you for your presentation. I recently read Shoghi Effendi Recollections by Ugo Jakari, which covers from 1948 until the rest of his life. It will be great to have another session covering his life during that period.
yes. Maybe you can get Earl Redmond to do that.
Earl Redmond, that's a thought. Yeah, is there someone who's studied all the Pilgrim's Notes from that period of time? Yeah. I'm not sure what Saeed is asking about written version of with references. I think he's probably asking about.
Oh, he's asking for source material. Well, I can probably. Why don't you just give him my email? I'll try to.
Yeah, he can email us and we can forward the email to you, or he can.
Okay.
Anyone who has questions about this afterwards, once it's up on YouTube, they can post their comments and questions straight to our YouTube channel.
I see.
We will then forward them to you, and you can then answer, and we'll post the answers back up on the YouTube channel.
Okay.
So we get a certain amount of.
Well, you get better answers that way, I think, because I don't remember everything.
Yeah, exactly. Sandra also asks, was it difficult to research this early period of the guardianship? Were there fewer and more obscure sources, more difficult to access?
Well, the one part that it would be really hard. It's really hard to research and get balance is about Shoghi Effendi's family. Because there's covenant breakers who have issued their recollections and their versions of what happened, and there's nothing from the other side, very little. It's all very cryptic because of the issue of privacy, even for people who've been declared covenant breakers. So we don't have, I've tried to reconstruct, for example, what was going on with Hossein Afnan, mostly just from his activities. And, it is clear that, it's clear that Shoghi Effendi was suspicious that, or not happy with the fact that he wasn't able to stop the seizure of the house at the beginning, because he was there on the council, on the King's Council. Oh. But I don't think he could justly be blamed for that happening. Nevertheless, but I think that this was a a burning sentiment, so to speak, that was sort of the last straw. But again, without access to what Shoghi Effendi said about it privately, it would be really, really hard to put it together.
As I understand it, there were quite a few either members of Baha'u'llah's family or just simply Baha'is in Palestine who actually acquired positions of considerable importance in the Middle East, not only in Palestine, but you mentioned Iraq. And how does this happen? Do you think it's partly because there were education, because of their
education was a big part of it, and Abdu'l-Bahá had something to do with it because the statesmen consulted him, and that is in fact how Hussein Afnan got started, was through Abdu'l-Bahá's recommendation. So, but yeah, Abdu'l-Bahá was educating his family at the University of Beirut and Syrian Protestant College. Well, there weren't that many college-educated English-speaking Baha'is, Middle Easterners. So, yes, there were at least three secretaries to high mandate officials in Palestine, and another, and they also were in other places, I think mainly in the British mandates, not as much. I don't think they were like in Lebanon or the French mandates territories weren't. It wasn't like that. But it certainly made a difference. And then when they had to leave, that was a bit of a test for them. They had to give up good positions.
Yeah, prestige, knowing important people, being able to sway important decisions. Those are all difficult things.
Yeah, well, I think that Badi Bouchroui had been appointed a judge at a certain point, and by the time he was asked to leave, and
Says, who else knew of the guardianship before Shoghi Effendi and the reading of the Will and Testament?
Well, I don't know comprehensively, obviously, but there were covenant breakers who knew.
Oh, really?
I say this because they published a book that said around 1912 or 13 that Abdu'l-Bahá was grooming Shoghi Effendi to be the next leader or something. So, of course, Shoghi Effendi would never have read that book. So there you go. But my guess is, I'm speculating, but I think that Badi'ullah, when he came back to the family briefly, probably obtained that information and understanding that, understood he wasn't going to be the leader and defected again, and carried that information with him. That's my guess, but it's speculation. I know there were Iranian Baha'is who I just can't remember who it was, but I've seen memoirs where they talk about their parent or somebody's father knowing about it, and then there, of course, is that the German non-Baha'i
doctor.
Was it a doctor or nurse? I've forgotten, but yeah. Who was told that, in sort of allegorical terms, though, I mean, what do you think of my Elijah? This not that exact. Yeah. I can't imagine that the greatest holy leaf didn't know, but I don't know who else did. It was obviously kept a secret because Abdu'l-Bahá was trying to protect him and that's why I think you don't see it referred to anywhere else in the writings.
Right.
Whereas the House of Justice is referred to all over the place.
Yep.
The guardianship is only in one place.
Yep.
And
including the various statements Abdu'l-Bahá made in America. No reference to the guardianship, only to the Universal House of Justice.
That's right.
Talking to the friends about the future. It's in my diary. Frequently is references the House of Justice and no reference to Shoghi Effendi or the guardianship.
That's right.
Yep. And I think Bahá'í Rouhani Mahani's our last talk said that the greatest holy leaf did indeed know. I think she said that actually.
Yeah.
Her talk. So
it would be hard to believe that she didn't.
Yeah.
She was such a confidant of Abdu'l-Bahá. It's just, it's unthinkable, really. But
anyway, he's going to trust anybody with that information. He's got to trust it with her.
Right.
Yeah. Well, who else would he? Who else would he?
Yeah, exactly.
Camilla asked this question. Bahia Khanum in her recent talk, recent talk about Bahia Khanum, mentioned that Shoghi Effendi left Haifa several times due to illness in the early years. Can you tell us more about these times?
Well, they weren't as long as this. Shoghi Effendi got sick a lot.
Yeah.
And that's a very common thing to see in pilgrims' notes. Shoghi Effendi's sick, and particularly, I think it's Aziz Bahadur wrote that that he had susceptibility to malaria and usually left in the summers for that reason. But he didn't leave for 8 months at a time. He was, sometimes I think it was under doctor's instructions to go to a different climate. That was a very common thing in those days before air conditioning and that. Europeans went to Egypt and but he mostly in the 20s, I would say he mostly went away to Switzerland and did his hiking thing. But he also, he spent time in France. He went to South Africa. He went to other places. But I don't think that's where he went to get well. I think Switzerland, maybe Germany. He did go to doctors in Germany. I think other members of his family also went to Germany for doctors.
Gary asks, we've got a couple more questions here too. How much information do we have about any consultations that may have taken place between Shoghi Effendi and the greatest holy leaf?
Probably none. Just if it's just the two of them, but I think that you might get some clues from the pilgrim's notes of women who talked to the greatest holy leaf, because she was somewhat more forthcoming about, and also other women in the family. If you look at these notes where women were, spending time with the women of the family, they're pretty rich about the details of the family and their concerns, or at least from the women's perspective, which is great actually. But I don't know. I have seen some things. I'm not sure that I trust them that much as sources, but it does seem that she may have tried to curtail Shoghi Effendi's impulses a bit. That's the perception people had. And
such as going away, you mean?
Such as what? Going away? She was probably responsible for him coming back the first time. although it was his mother who, and I think an aunt who went to retrieve them. But before that, if I recall, Hippolyte Dreyfus had been sent to check up on him. And yeah, no, I think maybe, I don't know. I mean, that's just the sense I get from various sources, that she was trying to, she was sort of the peacemaker of the family, I guess you'd say. And so that does involve more than one side. It always does. But how much we're privy to what really happened, I don't think we know.
Possibly there's material in the archives that will never be released, or might be released in 500 years or something.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, she didn't keep a diary so far as I know, and I don't think Shoghi Effendi kept a diary either. So not since 1919 or something. So maybe no, and Rehia Khanum was on the scene too late for that, so she would have known. But
yeah, that's true. When did Monere Khanum pass away?
Later, I think it was in the 40s, I think. Yeah.
Well, there was still that connection too, possibly for a little while.
Yeah. Well, was she still in the fold at that time?
I don't know. I don't know the timing of these things.
Yeah.
Lee asked a different question, which I asked you earlier.
Yeah.
Who are the members of the Spiritual Assembly of Palestine/Haifa? And you mentioned that Shoghi Effendi's father eventually became a covenant breaker.
I didn't mention that.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. But maybe he did. But
That's right. You just said that he was Shoghi Effendi's secretary.
He took dictation for him, for Persian letters early on, but I don't know who was on the LSA of Haifa, but I don't think it would be too hard to find out if you could get a hold of the Haifa newsletter. So I think that's something that really should be digitized sooner rather than later, since it has a bearing on the whole world, really, the whole Baha'i world. It would be very useful.
Yeah, that's for sure. Paul asks, do we know, Farzad asks, who was the Guardian's first secretary?
Well, there was not a first. I mean, he had multiple secretaries at once. He had Persian secretaries. And I think the first two Persian secretaries were Mahmoud Zaghani and Azizullah Bahadur, who had been serving as secretaries for Abdu'l-Bahá. And in terms of English language secretaries, I think Azizullah also did some English language secretarial work, because there was no one else. And then at some point fairly early, I think Sohail Afnan and Ruhi Afnan got involved in that work and did it intermittently.
Up until sometime in the 30s, at any rate, because Ruhi Khanum became one of his main secretaries once she was.
Indeed, yeah, she did. She must have worked her tail off, because he was, I mean, you see how busy he was, working 20 hours a day. Who can keep up with that? Well, you can see why he had a hard time getting secretaries too.
That's all. Just like the story of Abdu'l-Bahá dictating a tablet in Persian to one guy, and then he turns to the other guy and starts continuing the dictation of a tablet in Arabic. It goes back to the first guy.
Well,
tablet in Persian.
I think if you look at the translations that Ahmad Sohrab did when he was there, he had the habit of putting the time of day on his translation. A lot of times it was 2 a.m., 3 a.m. I think he wanted people to know he was working.
Seems likely. That seems likely. I don't see any other questions right offhand.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think. Well, one of the things I wanted to ask you is that my impression, anyway, is that to some extent the Guardian, there's a place where the Guardian names the Tablet of Carmel, the Will and Testament of Abdu'l-Bahá, and the Tablets of the Divine Plan as the three charters of the faith. And it
That's
seems
right.
you could very easily say those are the three charters of the guardianship, because they're the documents that establish the World Center and the need to build the World Center, set the tone for teaching and the direction of teaching, and then, of course, the Will and Testament does the administrative order and the authority of the Guardian to translate and to interpret. So it's like there's everything like the Guardian needed right there in those three documents.
Yeah, in terms of, well, it certainly is what he set his goals on, that's for sure. And, he might, if he lived another 100 years, he might have found other things that needed attention and found a mandate for them. But at the time, what else? I mean, obviously the administrative order was critically important because the House of Justice needed to be elected. And that required a lot of spreading of the faith as well as spreading of the institutions. And
Yeah, and the systematic spreading of the faith really had to wait until there was sufficient numbers of institutions to issue plans.
That's right. Yeah.
In the 20s, it was basically traveling teachers that were going out, and they weren't even necessarily establishing LSAs.
Yeah. Well, one of the things you can really get from this, and even, I mean, just from this data, I mean, is that he had really supreme executive skills, because he could see, like, exactly what order things needed to be done in. And, a lot of people can't. A lot of people can't do that, but he was, it was remarkable. Even some of the pilgrims who were very well educated remark on his executive ability. And he was young at the time he took over, but you see those skills even right from the, even that period where he had those people that are consulting with him. He was issuing very far-sighted directives, like, starting right off with the establishment of assemblies. And even though he didn't want to be the guardian, he could see, he had the vision, nevertheless, to carry out what needed to be done.
Yeah. Said asked about the guardian's mother, and whether she became a covenant breaker. What was about her?
I can't answer that. I've wondered about that myself. And I always have felt that his parents were in sort of a gray area, that I can't find anything definitive.
Yeah, my impression, maybe Ruhil Khanum says this, is that he didn't really want to declare them covenant breakers, and so he held off on
Yeah.
But they were nevertheless associating with the members of the family who had broken the covenant, and that was basically.
Well, they don't. The House of Justice has taken the position that they don't necessarily need to declare covenant breakers if they're out there and no one, and they're not doing anything. Why draw attention to them by taking action? And they just leave them be. And so that would have, I can't say what was going through the guardian's mind, obviously, but I don't know what happened with his parents. Some people regarded them as covenant breakers, clearly, and other people aren't sure. I'm one of those. I'm not sure.
Interesting. Well, I don't see any other questions right offhand. Perhaps, just one popped in here from Gary. If I remember correctly, it was at Abdu'l-Bahá's instruction that Shoghi Effendi went to Oxford. Did English have the status then, like it does today, as a de facto world secondary language or world second language?
I thought it was French, but in those days, so I'm not sure that that's the case. I'm also not sure that it was Abdu'l-Bahá instruction for him to go to Oxford. I think that was his own desire, and that Abdu'l-Bahá allowed for it.
Shoghi Effendi made when he was in Paris, if I remember right.
That is correct.
Yeah, he was in Paris to rest and recover.
Right, but he
worked too hard as secretary for Abdu'l-Bahá.
But he applied to Oxford while he was there.
Yes.
And I don't know, that he asked Abdu'l-Bahá until afterwards. Yeah, so. The scuttlebutt that I read is that Abdu'l-Bahá wanted him to return, and he wouldn't or didn't, or it wasn't he wasn't going to make it, I guess is what it was. I mean, Abdu'l-Bahá did want to go to Shoghi Effendi wanted to go to graduate school. That's clear. Mm-hmm. He did want to get a graduate degree. Whether at Oxford or somewhere else, but that's about it. That's all I can say.
Paul Mantle also says that he had heard Ruhil Khanum say that she did not want to be buried in the same cemetery in Haifa as Shoghi Effendi's parents, whom she referred to as those people, and that only their initials are on their gravestones, not their names.
Is that right? I didn't know that.
That's what Paul Mantle says. I don't know whether he spent some time in Haifa or not.
Well, that makes.
So that is interesting. Another question that came, I think, from the Facebook or YouTube. Did people view his youth initially in positive or negative terms?
I think both. I mean, yes, there were certainly people, especially I think within his family. Yeah. I know Baha'is saying that there were older people in the community who were reluctant to follow him. But what I've actually seen in sources, things like Mountford Mills, who's and people. There's a lot of people are always talking about his abilities and how sharp he is, and how and since he's youthful, energetic, and most of what I've seen is actually quite positive from the older Baha'is who met him, and so I'm not sure who those people are or were. They may have existed, but definitely his family members had some issues with it, because who wants the next generation telling you what to do?
Yeah. Well, I think it may have also been true of the people who were sort of pretenders like Sohrab and Farid, who certainly would easily say, well, we've been secretary for Abdu'l-Bahá for all these years, and we saw him in action. We know, what he was doing and what he was thinking, and you're just 23 or 24 years old.
Yeah, Sohrab did say that, yes, but I don't know if Farid said that. I think they both advocated for the election of the House of Justice immediately. According to Earl Redmond, most of the people who were there did. I don't remember. I think I've gone through the same sources he did. I don't remember that being so definitive. But certainly some of them saw wisdom in it. And but I don't think most of them went away with any bad feelings about how except for maybe Avare, he was, of course, became a covenant breaker, but of the others who were called to console, Remy was a little miffed that he didn't get included in the discussions about the House of Justice, but he didn't think it needed to be elected right off.
Well, that may be the end of our questions now.
Okay.
And people are saying thank you for a fascinating presentation. It really was quite interesting. And I'm glad that we had a chance to break some new ground in terms of exploring some of the details of this particular period of time. So I thank you again for this marvelous presentation. And I thank the audience for participating. We'll be seeing you again, unless we have some things in December. I don't know for sure yet. I'm hoping we'll get that resolved soon. And until then, thank you everybody for joining us today, and have a good day. Goodbye.
Thank you.